You happen to not be familiar with Tim. Tim Slade is a speaker, author, award-winning freelance e-learning designer, and the creator of the E-Learning Designers Academy, which I have a feeling several of us have heard of. Having spent over a decade working to help others elevate their e-learning content, Tim has been recognized and awarded within the e-learning industry multiple times for his creative and innovative design aesthetics. He makes some beautiful stuff, basically. Tim is also an international speaker, a recognized articulate superhero, and author of the E-Learning Designer's Handbook. And we are super excited to have you here today, Tim, and to hear
Yeah.
your story about leaping into freelancing full time and how that went for you. And I'll let you take it away.
All right. Well, good. Well, thank you so much for having me, Courtney. I know we were talking a moment ago that we've, exchanged words online in the past, and I'm sure I know some of the names here, Tammy and a few others. So I'm happy to see you all here as well. So thank you so much for having me. So I don't know where I want to begin today. I really want this to be, one of the things that I'll start by saying this. When I was first getting started with freelancing, which would have been over 10 years ago now. And I think this still exists to a certain extent, is that it was really hard to get like straightforward answers about like the real intricacies of how you be a freelancer, right? Like how do people go find their clients, or how much should I charge for a project, or what is the going rate? And I remember when I was first starting, for a lot of freelancers, they kept all of that stuff, close to their chest, and it was hard to get a straight answer. And I've always hated that about working in freelancing. And I don't know, I think a lot of it comes from like the cultural stuff that we've, if you're like myself, I'm turning 40 next year, so I'm an elder millennial, but like my generation and past, it was always yucky to talk about money and talk about, the nitty-gritty of what it is that we do. And I hate that. So I say all that to say that like today, what I really want to get from this session and what I want to be able to provide all of you is a really no holds barred. Is that how you say that expression? You know what I mean? Like a really transparent view into the world of freelancing, whether that's talking about rates, talking about money, talking about firing clients, talking about finding clients, and everything in between. So I say all that to say, don't hold back. I hope you all have lots of questions for me. So is that fair? Okay. Has anyone experienced that? Like that? Can't get a straight answer about this freelancing stuff? Anyone willing to share that? If you're willing to come off mute. Whoever comes off mute the first and talks, I have nothing to give you, but I'll be really happy for you. Who wants to get off mute and talk about their experience having a hard time getting answers to their questions?
That's really dangerous for me because I love to talk. But I'll say,
Okay.
yes, I have moved into the freelancing world, but my first contract ended up being 19 months. So I now am moving back into trying to maneuver into contracts and trying to get people to talk to me about, okay, who's hiring, who's not hiring, who's hot right now, who's not. That's really challenging for me.
Okay, good. I like that. Anyone else have those the same experiences? And Mara, the question was challenges in getting straightforward answers about the world of freelancing, or like what are some of those things that are just really still ambiguous to you that we can talk about today? And then I'll tell a little bit about my story, and then we can kind of go into a Q&A from there.
Hi, this is Emily Keener. I
Hey,
have
Emily.
found that I've got a ton of resources on like copyright, like people who do copywriting and for the freelance
Mm,
world, and not so many for instructional designers. So I'm a technical writer too. Obviously, it's our sister career, and so
yeah.
I followed all these writers, and a lot of them are doing copy and content writing, and they're pretty free with that information, but not so much. I don't have anything to go by when it comes to instructional design.
Okay, good. Any other roadblocks people have ran into that we want to talk about today?
This is Tyler Bradbury. I found that a lot of the answers I got did not reflect what my experiences were.
Oh,
So,
can you give me an example?
people would say you should never ask for less than $60 an hour, and then everyone wanted to pay you 40, for example. Or, you should have a niche, but then you just had to take whatever you could find. So it
Yeah.
was interesting the disconnect between what people were telling me I was supposed to do and what I ended up doing.
Okay, I like that. I have thoughts on both of that. Tammy, I saw your hand up. Go ahead, Tammy, and then I'll jump into my stuff.
Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody from Southern California. I think that the biggest hurdle that I've got is where people say, oh, yeah, there's plenty of work out there, but they won't help me figure out where to look.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm sitting here going, I can do lots of stuff. I enjoy doing lots of stuff. And there are unicorns out there, and then the job descriptions just give you everything but the kitchen sink. Thank God I've already learned to read the job descriptions. And when I have the recruiting conversation, I'm like, so how many people are on the team? Because this looks like a 5-person checklist. But still, you know, the initial concern is, yeah, there's work out there. Where do I find it?
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, okay, I want to talk about all this stuff, and I'll forewarn you all, like I could go on and on and on and on about everything I've learned in the last 10 years of freelancing. So let's start here. I want to tell the story of how I started freelancing and some of the struggles that a lot of mental struggles that I ran into that I think held me back for over 10 years. And then we can kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty stuff with finding clients, the disparity between what you hear online versus what reality looks like. And gosh, that's a whole loaded thing because I feel like LinkedIn is a whole world of like doesn't represent at all what's really happening in our industry, but that's a separate topic for a separate day, I suppose. So for me, I started freelancing without ever having any intention of freelancing. This would have been back in 2012. I was working at Kohl's department stores doing training and instructional design. And I had taken on this role. I left Kohl's and I started working at this Department of Corrections for the state of Wisconsin. And one of the things, this has nothing to do with freelancing, but it kind of speaks to why I took on freelancing projects was, you know, when you move from the private sector into the public sector, it's a real shock to the system. You know, when you work in the private sector, everything's about ROI and about the business. And then in the public sector, in a public sector job, they don't even know what ROI means. Like the driver isn't to move the organization forward in any sort of way. Like more often than not, it's about keeping your department out of the news and out of the headlines and what's going to keep the governor not on your back or on his bad side. It was an awful, awful thing. And I found myself like totally brain dead in this job. And so my first freelance job fell into my lap because somebody that I knew on LinkedIn, or it wasn't, I don't know if it was LinkedIn, it was like the Articulate community or something. They had just gotten this new job and they'd been freelancing and they had to get rid of this client. And they're like, hey, would you pick up this client for me? The project was quite literally, here's some ugly PowerPoints. They need to make these PowerPoints pretty. They're these training PowerPoints. And I was like, yeah, that would be great. And she was like, well, they were paying me $50 an hour. Does that seem fair? And I was like, I don't know. Sure, I'll take that. $50 an hour sounds amazing, to like putz around and make PowerPoint pretty all day. And so I took this job and I started doing it during my nights and weekends. I had no idea what I was doing. There was no sort of contract in place. It was a really, really, I just enjoyed doing the work. And I remember somehow that led to another freelancing job through PetSmart. Somebody knew the person I was freelancing for, and I got a freelance gig at PetSmart. And I was really dumb at the time. I had no concept of like I should ask for money up front rather than just like work for 9 months for nothing and then get a check at the end of it. So I worked on this project for like literally 9 months. And again, there was no contract in place. I was just charging, I think at that point, I was still charging $50 an hour. And I worked for 9 months and I never received a dime because in my mind, I got to do all this work before I get any money from these people. And so at the end of the 9 months, I got this check for like $20,000. I can't remember exactly how much it is. I have a picture of me holding it. And I was like blown away that I was, making more money doing what I was doing during my nights and weekends part-time than I was making during my regular full-time job. And the bug got in my head. I was like, gosh, I would just love to do this full time. Like, this would be so fun to just like quit my job and do this all day long. And I didn't do that for a whole host of reasons. Like, a huge chunk of that money went to pay off, because I was like 23 at the time. I knew nothing. And so, like, a huge chunk of that money went to paying off some student loan debt, some credit card debt, helping us get ahead and putting some money in savings and all of that stuff. And then the other mistake that I made is, I didn't know anything about taxes, so I didn't withhold any taxes from it. And so that next year, I ended up getting like this huge bill, and I had to take on more projects on the side to pay off that previous year's tax bill. So I probably ended up even though I paid off a little bit of credit card debt and whatnot. But I had this bug in my mind of like, oh, I would just love to do this full time. And every time I would think about that, I would talk myself out of it, because one of the things that I don't know if this relates, if anyone this resonates with anybody, but one of the things that my generation, and I know for generations before me, we are like, we grow up being told that our definition of success means you graduate high school, you go to college, you get into debt, you figure out what you're going to do for the rest of your life at like 18, as if you have any business knowing what you're going to do for the rest of your life at that age. Then you go find a cozy corporate job, and you're supposed to stay put forever until like you get a pension, and those don't exist anymore. And then you get to like retire in Boca Raton, Florida, or Sun City, Arizona, depending on whether you like a dry heat or the humidity. And so I thought, well, no, I can't quit my job. What about my benefits? What about health insurance? What about my 401k? I got to keep climbing the corporate ladder. So I did nothing. I kept working. I kept climbing the corporate ladder. I would take on freelance projects during my nights and weekends, primarily as a creative escape from what I was doing 9 to 5 that I absolutely hated. And fast forward to 2016 at this point, I took on a role at GoDaddy, managing their instructional design team for the whole company. And I was managing almost like 20 instructional designers. And I found myself absolutely miserable. One of the things that I learned is that I hate it. I don't really want to climb the corporate ladder. I didn't really want to lead a team of people. I really wanted to be a doer and make some more money being a really good doer, because that's what I like doing. I like doing the craft of instructional design and learning development. And so the job there was really toxic, and it got really, really bad. And this would have been at the end of 2018. We were about to go on our holiday break there. I always try to take the 2 weeks off at the end of the year from Christmas to New Year's. And there was something happening at work, and it was really, really, really bad. And I left work for the holidays, and I was just, excuse my language, I'm gonna be me. I was like, fuck it, I can't stand this place. And I was like, I am not opening up my work laptop for these 2 weeks. And in fact, I'm gonna build my website, and I'm gonna pretend like I quit my job and I'm starting a freelance business just so I can see what this feels like. And it was like the most amazing 2 weeks ever. Like, I built my portfolio. I started thinking about like, well, what would this look like? Like, what would it look like? How would I start freelancing full time? And how much would I have to make? And how much would I have to charge per hour? And how many hours would I have to work on average in order to, you know, make the amount of money I was making at GoDaddy and pay my bills, right? When I was at GoDaddy, and this is where I'll be completely transparent, I was making like 120,000 a year, which was really good at the time. In retrospect, I was grossly underpaid for the amount of work and how many people I was managing, but at the time it was good money. And then when I broke that down to an hourly rate, I was like, oh, it really wasn't that much. Like, I didn't actually have to work that many hours if I charged, let's say, $100 an hour or $95 an hour. And then I thought, oh, if I could offset some of this with maybe doing some workshops or some speaking or something along those lines, it actually didn't add up to being that much money. And I was really fortunate at the time. My partner, he had a job, we were on his insurance. So I thought, oh, I could do this. And so I came back from that holiday break, and I told my boss, like, I'm out, I'm done. I'm going to quit my job. And there was the caveat, though, that I couldn't leave until April. because I needed to get my bonus and I needed my RSUs, my stock options to vest so that I could have a little bit more of a cushion than I had at the time. So the last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A and we can jump into whatever we want to say, is that I was, in retrospect, I was super, super, super conservative in making the leap into freelancing. By the time I quit that April of 2019, I had a year's worth of my pay in the bank because I really wanted to give myself the space and the freedom to give this a try. And I told myself, like, in 6 months, if this doesn't work out, then I'll just go find another job. And one of the interesting things that I did leading up to that is I spoke with 3 people. I spoke with 3 people that I knew who freelanced. I spoke to Kath Ellis. She's a freelancer out of Australia. She's a good friend of mine. I spoke with Kevin Thorne. He's a freelancer in Mississippi. He's a good friend of mine. And I spoke with Jacqueline Hutchinson. She's a freelancer out of Canada. And I asked them all 2 questions. I asked them, how many months of your pay did you have in the bank when you decided to freelance full time? And how long after you started freelancing did you realize, oh, I think it's going to be okay? And so it was fascinating. Some people, like, I won't say who said what. Some of them were like, oh, I had 2 weeks worth of pay in the bank, which scared the shit out of me. I'm like, that's crazy. Some people had several months. Nobody had a year's worth of their pay. But everyone said consistently, by the time they quit and went freelancing full time, they knew within the first couple of weeks it was going to be just fine. So I waited until I had a year's worth of my pay, which I thought, which still made me a nervous wreck, because if you've ever, for those of you who freelance full time, when you quit your job and you, like, that first 2 weeks and you realize a paycheck is not going to hit your bank account again, because we're so accustomed to that happening, it really gives you night sweats. It really causes anxiety. Even if you had 3 years of pay in your bank, you would freak out. It freaks you out. But I quit. And I announced that to the world, like, I'm freelancing. And it was within 2 weeks, I was like, oh, I'm going to be just fine. Because once I announced it to everybody, that's when the work started rolling in. So I share all of that. I share that story as kind of like our starting point here, because the point that I want to say about that is I waited 10 years. I waited almost 10 years to start freelancing. And I waited until I had almost a year's worth of pay in the bank before I decided to finally make the leap. And in retrospect, I probably could have made the leap when I first started, but it was like unprogramming myself from this idea that in order to grow, it meant climbing the corporate ladder, and that was my only definition of career success. So I know that was a long story. So I just wanted to give that story to give just a kind of a starting point for my journey into it. So yeah, I don't know. Where do we want to go from there? What questions do you have about that story? And then we'll lead that into other questions that we might get into. So feel free to just come off mute or put stuff in chat.
I have a question, and thanks for sharing the context
thank you,
there.
Laura.
I'm coming to y'all from very cold Brooklyn today. My question is around, I'm doing these freelance gigs on the side. I kind of just fell into it, and it's really cushioned me from 2 layoffs in 8 months, which is really not great for the soul. But the freelancing has really saved me. The one thing I go back and forth in my head about is, like, should I make an LLC? Should I be doing this like in a more official way? I have like the portfolio. I'm treating it as sole proprietorship right now, but I'm wondering if and when you made that shift and what your pros and cons are on that.
That's a great question. So initially, I didn't have an LLC until I started freelancing full time. In retrospect, that was an awful idea. I should have done an LLC right away. You should do an LLC. It primarily, and this is, this can vary from country to country. So I'm speaking about US at the very minimum. The LLC separates your business from you from a liability standpoint. So if for some reason a client were to sue you because of something, they're not suing you, they're suing your business. And so they wouldn't be able to come after any of your personal assets. But in order for that to stand up in court, I'm giving a grossly simplified version of this though. In order for that to be true, having an LLC means you need to completely separate your personal finances from your business finances. So it requires you to open a business account, all of that stuff. And that seems like a lot of work on the front end, but it's really a good thing to do, to set yourself up that way. So an LLC, I did mine on LegalZoom. It was like $600. It took me an hour to set up. Really, really easy. But the other thing too, I would recommend, and this is for everybody out there, and this lesson cost me literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. I would go get an accountant ASAP. Go get an accountant. Don't try to do your own accounting. I did my own accounting and my own bookkeeping up until literally the year before last. And one of the things the first thing my accountant did was he changed my business structure from an LLC sole proprietorship to an LLC S Corp. The difference between an S Corp and an LLC sole proprietorship means, yeah, it separates the liability of your business and you. But all of the money that you earn still runs through your personal taxes. And so when that happens, you're paying that 15% self-employment tax. You're paying a lot of these extra taxes that you don't have to pay. Well, not that you don't have to pay, but it's less when it's a LLC S Corp. The S Corp makes your business, it makes you an employee of your business entity, and it's a little bit more convoluted, but the accountant takes care of all of it. So you have to give yourself, you have to set yourself a salary of sorts. It can be whatever number. And you can still have access to all of your money. It's all just paperwork on the back end. But when I did that when I changed from an LLC sole proprietorship to an S Corp, my refund that year was over $100,000 because that's how much more I was paying in taxes, was in the figure of 6 figures a year. And so that was a huge wake up call, and I should have done that years ago. It's when it comes to the money stuff, like when you feel, at least this was true for me. Like I grew up with zero financial literacy from my parents at all, and so my big fear was like that fear that a lot of people have, like when you go to the dentist, when you haven't gone to the dentist in a long time. I don't know if anyone can relate to this. There's another thing my wonderful parents didn't do for me is take me to the dentist regularly. Your fear of going to the dentist is really like, you don't want to be exposed for how ignorant you really are, right? And that was my big fear too. So I did a lot of shopping around for an accountant, and I was really straightforward. I'm like, you got to explain this shit to me like I'm a 5-year-old because I don't know anything. And so once I pulled that Band-Aid off, it was the best feeling ever. I'm so happy I did that. So I know that was a long answer, but I hope that helps Mara.
So Tim, while we're on the topic of money, since we're already here, I'll pull up some questions that we had previous to the session today. Somebody asked, which option do you think is better, paying, subcontracting with agencies, or just being a full-on freelancer with direct clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're going to make more money working directly with clients every single day of the week. But subcontracting is a really great way to get your feet wet. But the cost of subcontracting is that, there's more people who have to take a piece of that pie, but you also aren't going to be fully responsible for the entire project. So for example, a company I used to work for, Artisan Learning, any custom e-learning or instructional design company, they subcontract all their work, right? And so you're going to expect to make 40, 50, 60, maybe $75 an hour. You're not going to be able to charge 100, 125 or $200 an hour because there are more people who need a piece of that pie. But the benefit is you get to just focus on doing whatever work, the script writing, the e-learning development, what have you. You're not doing all the client management stuff. So it's a good way to get your feet wet and not have all that responsibility, but you're going to make way more money working directly with the client. But that comes with, all that extra minutia of finding the client and managing that relationship.
Yeah. And then another related question, when you are working with a direct client, what's better, hourly or project-based pricing?
So I love this question, and this is the conclusion I've come to. All the voices out there are like, you got to do project-based, value-based pricing, where you charge a flat fee and you can charge more, and then you try to be as efficient as you can with your hours. And for me, I've come to the conclusion that it depends on the project. So I'll tell you how I determine whether I'm doing a project-based or hourly rate. So it depends on how clearly defined the scope is. So the more defined the scope of the project is, the more likely I am to charge a project rate. But if the scope is ambiguous, if we're not 100% clear what we're going to be building, that sort of stuff, then I'm going to be doing my hourly rate because I'm not going to lose money because of your indecision as a client. But one of the other things that I do too is, and this is for me, this is different for every freelancer. I'm also not interested in working with clients who don't know what they want. You know, like one of my red flags when I work with a client for e-learning development, if they've never done e-learning development before, they've never hired freelancers before, those are red flags where it just, I don't know if I'm not sure if I'm your guy because I don't want to have to train you on how this works, but that's my own personal opinion. So that's how I divide it. If the scope is really clear, and then I'm more likely to charge a project rate because if the scope's not clear, then how do I know when I'm out of scope? Like how do I tell them, hey, we've gone beyond this project fee? So the scope has to be really clear in order for me to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for answering that, Tim.
Mhm.
Who else has a question? Jump in here.
Yeah, let's keep going.
Hi, I just had a really quick question about the quality of the way you stand out and finding the niche. I know that there's a lot of conversation about IDs and learning designers getting a broader scope and being able to cross industries, but has that been beneficial for you in your experience? Has it been efficient for your time and the work that goes into the projects? How has that fared for you and what recommendation can you make?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you say your name? Is it Shaka?
Shaka.
Shaka.
Hmm.
Okay, thank you, Shaka.
Of course.
Um, so I'll tell a story real quickly about why I'm against a specific type of niching that I think a lot of people talk about. When they talk about niching, people are like, oh, you should niche towards a specific type of industry like healthcare or the travel industry or something along those lines. And I remember there was this guy who was trying to be a freelance influencer type person. And this was in 2019. And the example he kept using was like, you need to niche down to like the cruising industry or the airline industry or the travel industry. And then 2020 came and the pandemic hit, and I couldn't help but think back and I was like, gosh, I wonder how that worked out for those people who did that. You know what I mean? And so I'm not a big fan of niching into an industry. It can work for you in some instances. Like if you have a deep expertise in, I don't know, I'm making this up, healthcare, and you already have an established network, then great. Like, let's capitalize on that. But if you're just a general freelancer and you're just arbitrarily choosing an industry and you don't really have a deep expertise in that or an established rapport, like that's just going to be really hard and it just feels arbitrary. So I'm not a big fan of niching into an industry. I'll give one other exception where I've seen that work really well, but I'm more interested in niching into a specific skill set or modality. So, in my experience, there are two reasons why companies hire freelancers. Either a lack of capability on their existing team or a lack of capacity. So capability means they need something done, but they don't have the capability on their internal team to do that thing. Or they need something done and they don't have the capacity on their team in order to do that thing. In either instance, there's a specific thing that they need done, and they want it done a certain way. And so, for example, for me as a freelancer, I'm not like I hate not that I hate I I think it's a bad idea to just say like I'm a freelance instructional designer. My response would be like, what does that mean though? Like it would be like saying I'm a freelance photographer. What, like a wedding photographer, a freelance landscape photographer, a freelance portrait photographer? Like all of those share very similar skill sets, but they're all very different in terms of the intricacies of the output and what you have to deal with to get there. Like a wedding photographer and a landscape photographer deal with very different dynamics, right? So for me, like as I think about myself as a freelancer, where my niche is and where I'm really specific about what I do is I design and develop highly engaging, visually appealing, interactive e-learning courses in Articulate, Storyline, Rise, and Camtasia. That's what you would see on my portfolio. That's what I talk about online when I'm at conferences or online or on LinkedIn. That's what you see in my YouTube channel. That's what you see in my book. That's what I talk about, and that is who I am. And so when somebody's looking for, they have that lack of capability or capacity on their team for highly engaging, visually, engaging e-learning, then my name comes up for that. So that's my take on niching. The other exemption to that I like back in when recreational marijuana was becoming legal initially in Colorado, there was one guy that I knew that niched into training specifically for dispensaries because there was so much legal regulation around it and there was no training available. So he was able to make a really profitable niche being the provider of that sort of training, right? So you could make a niche in like emerging markets, but I'm not a big fan of saying like go niche into this industry because there's a lot that requires you to be successful in doing that. Does that make sense as I say all that? Okay, good. I saw you clap. Thank you, Shaka. Okay, good.
I love it. I'm going to bring a few out of the chat here. So Kelsey says she wants to know how freelancers are affording things like programs and resources and business expenses and all of that. And then there's also a reply, some back and forth about, does the client provide the programs or do you?
Yeah,
so kind of what's your thought on that and like how you afford everything that we have to have as freelancers?
Gosh, that's a good question. Well, I mean, there's not a pretty cozy answer with this. You have to figure out how to pay for it, right? And that might mean you go into debt. I went into debt for the tools that I needed in order to freelance, but I didn't go into debt for things that I didn't need at the moment. So if I took on a project that required a tool, I made sure that my cost of that project could ultimately pay for that stuff that I needed in order to do it. The client does not provide the tools. Like this is one of the things that we have to remember is that as a freelancer, you have to disconnect your idea that this is an employee-employer relationship. It is not. If you treat it like an employee-employer relationship, they're going to treat you like an employer, which you don't want, and you're going to make bad decisions as a result of it. This is a business-to-business transaction. And so, if you hired a mobile groomer to come give your dog a bath and they showed up and they're like, hey, do you have the shampoo and all of the stuff that I need? You would look at them like they're crazy, And so you provide it. It's a business expense and it's tax deductible. And, for me, that meant investing a lot on the front end, but investing on those things that I knew I could capitalize on with the project that I was taking on or what have you. So, in terms of affording it, yeah, it's expensive. Freelancing can be expensive on the front end, but you have to view it as an investment that you're making towards yourself and towards your business because that's what it is. It's a business, not you can't expect to be treated like an employee. So a couple things that I'll say real quickly off the bat, and I've seen these questions a lot. When you're a freelancer, clients are not going to train you how to do your job. They're not hiring to train you or hold your hand. They're expecting you to be able to operate and hit the ground running on day one. Otherwise, why bother hiring you? Like the whole premise of hiring a freelancer is you are taking off that client's plate something on their plate that they don't have room for. And so you have to be ready to hit the ground running on day one. And that is a mindset shift from that employee-employer relationship into a business-to-business type of mindset. It took me a while to get there, but yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Random note, just because I know we have some transitioning teachers in here, you can get a cheaper articulate license if you're still teaching, because they have an educator's discount.
They do.
And I know articulate is one of the biggest expenses we're all concerned about too, usually.
Yes, that is true.
So the next question from Juliana says, if I'm just starting out as a subcontractor, do I need a business setup or would it be better to wait and get that started whenever you leave subcontracting? So if you're just starting and you're mostly subcontracting, do you really need that LLC?
Yeah, I mean, you should. You can go without it, but again, if somebody were to come after you for some reason and you don't have an LLC, then any of your assets are on the table to be taken in the court of law. Your house, anything, your savings. The whole premise of the LLC is separating your business entity and your business finances from your personal entity and your personal finances. So, I mean, is that going to happen? Probably not. Like, nothing that we do is horribly legally liable, but yeah, you should. It's worth the couple $100 on LegalZoom to get that set up.
You also don't have to give your social security number out as often if you have a business number.
That's
I know
true.
when you're subcontracting, you have to fill out, those W-9s so frequently, and you can use your EIN instead of your personal social security number, just if
Yeah.
you're worried about that security.
Yep.
So how do you deal with overlapping contracts? Julian says so many contracts are 6 months, but within those 6 months, you get another client. I know I'm subcontracting. I have like 4 contracts in the air right now. I mean, how do you deal with all that?
I love that. Okay. I'll tell a story, and this is a lesson that I learned. One of the things that you do as freelancers, you run into these issues, these little hiccups along the way, and they all become things that you're like, I'm going to put that in my contract next time because I didn't foresee this outcome. So a couple of great examples of that, like one of the things that I started putting in my contracts, in my proposals and contracts, I'll say 2 things. Like, for example, when I submit a proposal to a client, I put a deadline on it. I'm like, this is good until, March 1st. Otherwise, I'm moving on. Like, shit or get off the pot. I am booked and busy. Book me or go. You know what I mean? And that little stuff like that helps them make decisions quicker. The other thing that I started doing was, like, in my contracts, I put, I'm only working with a single point of contact. You are not going to pass me around like a lady in the night or something with a million different subject matter experts. I'm working with a single person. That is it. Okay. So that's another thing that I did. Like, you're gonna have to respect me, and I'm not going to be passed around to everybody in your organization. But to your point about capacity, the other thing that I started doing in my contracts is I started putting in what's the word I'm thinking of that goes in a contract? A provision, if you will, that the project comes to an end at such and such date. Because I need to be able to plan for future projects and future clients. And this isn't going to go on for months and months and months and months, because I had one client where they just kept spinning their wheels and spinning their wheels and delay and delay and delay, and nothing ultimately got done. And then it was like 6 months later, they came knocking on my door and they're like, are you ready to begin? And I'm like, you disappeared 9 months ago or 6 months ago. No, I've moved on. So one of the ways I've done that is I put in my contract that this is the time frame in which you have me, and then and I have to be paid by that time or we're done. And so you those little things like help the stuff move on. Now, in terms of your capacity, I don't know. I don't have an answer for this. Like, I always have this horrible habit of signing up for biting off more than I can chew. And then when that happens, like, I just got to figure it out, and like I get the work done. And then I try not to make those mistakes again.
Yeah.
I know that was
For
a
a
long
few
answer to
months, and then
that.
we probably make the same mistake again, right? I know that
Yeah.
tends to be me.
Yeah.
So talking about contracts and things you might write in there, Mara asked about how to structure payment schedules so that you don't work for 6 months and then get that $20,000 check at the very end of that.
Okay, so I've done it 3 ways. One, I'll explain each one. One of them seems really enticing, but I learned I don't like this. So the typical way that I do it is I'll either do one of 2 things. I will split it into thirds. So 33% up front, 33% in the middle, 33% at the end. The challenge is figuring out what that middle point is. Is that, after you finalize the storyboard before you get into development, something along those lines. But I've done thirds, or you could do like, 25%, and do it in fourths, or 50% up front and then 25%. The one that I tend to do more often is 50-50. So 50% up front. It's a 50% payment and it's non-refundable. That's the other thing too that I do, going back to the previous question. You're going to pay 50% of this project up front, and you're not getting any of that back regardless of whether the project gets done or not. I mean, obviously, if I ditch out, that's a separate conversation. But if you don't do it and we don't do it, I'm keeping my 50% because you took up my time, right? And then 50% on the back end, adjusted according to, whether it's out of scope or whatnot. I have had a few clients. What will typically happen at the end of the year, let's say we're getting into November and December, and they want to do work in the new year. some clients will be like, hey, we'll just pay 100% upfront now so we can get it in this year's budget, but we won't start till February. You know what I mean? And you're thinking like, Yahtzee, great, I'm going to get all this money now, and then we'll work on it later. I've done that a few times, and I ultimately determined I don't like that, because by time you got that money, and then by the time you start the work, by the time you do the work, you don't feel like you're being paid anymore, because that money has already been hit your account. You've moved on with life. And so at least for me, it removes that that motivator, because it feels like I already got my money. You know what I mean? So I don't like doing 100% upfront. The only time I do that is if it's for like a workshop and I'm traveling and there's a lot of liability on my end with what I'm booking and whatnot. So 50-50 is what I do, or 50, 25, 25 or something like that.
We've had several variations of a question of how do you find clients? That's super broad, but
yeah. Okay. Here's what I'm going to say. There are no magical words that I'm going to say that's going to answer this question for everybody in a nice, easy, clean, convenient package. Okay. So let me get that off the bat real quickly. One of the things that I learned about myself, and I think this is true probably for most of us, because otherwise we wouldn't be asking this question, is I am not a big fan of, I'm not a salesperson. I don't want to go knocking on clients' doors. I don't want to annoy the hell out of people on LinkedIn. Like we all have all been on the receiving end of that shit. And I would rather run out into traffic with a blindfold on than be that kind of person that's like hustling and selling and all that stuff. And so my take on how I find clients, one of the strategies that I've employed is a lot of content marketing. And so the concept of content marketing, if you've never heard of it, content marketing is, I'll tell you a great company that's great at content marketing, Articulate. Okay. They're not as good as they used to be back, let's go back 5-10 years ago. Their community used to be way more robust, bustling place. That's a separate conversation for a separate day. But the concept of content marketing is you offer a lot of value to people for free. Okay, you whether it's on LinkedIn or YouTube videos or a blog post or speaking at a conference, you put yourself out there and you offer value to other people. And eventually, you offer value to people, and then eventually they have a need, and you've already offered them value, and they're going to remember you and they're going to come back to you. Or you shared a blog post and they've gone to your website and, oh yeah, okay, oh yeah, Shaka freelances. Oh, there's our services, right? And it kind of snowballs into you're building name recognition and a brand, and you're demonstrating your value through the content that you share. And then eventually, when those people have a need, they do eventually come back to you. So for me, the way I've worked to find clients is not going by finding the clients, but making it easy for the clients to find me. And so for me, I think a lot of times when you look at successful people on LinkedIn, it's easy to look at them and go, oh my gosh, they're so successful, but you don't see all of the effort and the time that went into where they're at that end of that journey. So for me, it involved a lot of speaking at conferences. It involved a lot of putting myself out there in ways that I normally am really uncomfortable with. Like putting myself on YouTube or posting on LinkedIn or all of that stuff, that's not innately comfortable for me, but it's a necessity in order to run a business. And so for me, I don't do anything to actively find clients. I do things to help clients find me by putting myself out there. And so one of the things, what I want to say about that, one of the things I want you to remember every time you second guess sharing something from your portfolio or posting on LinkedIn or submitting to speak at that conference or getting active in your local ATD chapter or thinking about, I would love to do that on YouTube, or who am I to be writing a blog post, or who am I to be doing this, that, or the other thing? Because those are all the barriers that prevent us from doing the things that are necessary in order to get business. What I want you to remember is that you can't run a business in secret. You can't run a business in secret. And you can't be a freelancer in secret. In order to get clients, they need to know who you are. And in order to know who you are, they need to know what you have to offer. And in order to know what you have to offer, you got to get comfortable putting yourself out there. And so I'm not a big fan of Like, I don't like going on Fiverr or Upwork. I don't recommend that. I mean, if you want to get started, that's a great place to get started. But the thing about that is nobody's going on Fiverr and Upwork to hire you. They're going on Fiverr and Upwork to find the cheapest person to do the thing that they need. And it really has nothing to do with you. But if you put yourself out there in whatever way you can, go start, volunteer to speak at your local ATD conference and share your expertise on whatever it is that you're doing, or start a blog or what have you. That is demonstrating your value in a way that it translates to people who might hire you. So, and that's going to look different for everybody. You know, how you show up online and how you put yourself out there, you have to figure out what is the most authentic way that you can do that where you it's not making you die slowly inside, because a lot of times people try to become influencers or do that stuff, but they end up creating a person that they don't even recognize and they can't maintain, you know. So you have to figure out how to do that authentically, and that's not a clean and simple convenient answer. But the freelancers who are the most successful, they put themselves out there. They put themselves out there. Yeah. That was a long
And I
answer.
just dropped this in the chat, but in case anybody's not watching the chat closely, we are having a whole nother community event on this topic of finding clients with Christy Tucker in a few weeks. So add that to your calendar if you're interested. Tim, another thing that several people kind of asked about is portfolios. Like, what do you need in your portfolio to get started, or on your resume? You know, what do you think is like the bare minimum there?
Okay.
And also, where do you host it, or, you know, what should it be?
So what's interesting about freelancing, we haven't talked about this, but it kind of intersects with your question, your mention of resumes. I've never once as a freelancer had anyone ever ask for my resume. I've never once as a freelancer been asked about my experience or my credentials, and or how long I've been doing this. You know, when you're walking around and you go to a store at a mall, you know, and there's this really great shirt you want to buy because it looks like it's a great quality shirt. It never once goes through your mind, oh gosh, I wonder how long this business has been doing this. Or I wonder if the person who made this shirt, like, do they have experience making these shirts? That none of that is relevant when you're freelancing. Don't get me wrong, I've had a few exceptions where people are like, I had one client who didn't want to go with me because they didn't have a master's degree, and I'm like, well, that's fine, that's your loss. That has no relevancy to what I'm doing as a freelancer. But okay, I've had that happen once in my career, but people don't make decisions for hiring freelancers. It's so much more objective because all they care about is like, can you do the thing I need you to do right now? That's really all they care about. And the risk and the reason why it's so much more objective, and this is where, again, you have to like get yourself out of that employer relationship and business to business relationship, is when you get hired as a freelancer, the risk is way lower on the employer by hiring you. They can terminate the contract at any time. And there's very little liability there because you agreed to that on the front end. But when you're an employee, like, it's not that simple to fire an employee if it's not working out, right? They're making a much bigger commitment when they're hiring an employee. So the resume thing is irrelevant, in my opinion, as it relates to freelancing. Your experience is irrelevant. Nobody cares. They care about, can you do the thing they need you to do? So now to your portfolio, there is no, my biggest pet peeve of advice is when people try to make it sound like the requirements of having a portfolio, especially for freelancers, is like this one size fits all thing. Like, oh, should I have X amount of projects? And should it be a mix of this, that, or the other thing? It all depends on what type of work you want to be doing. And so your portfolio should be a representation of what you have to offer and what you want to be hired for and what you're really good at. Whatever that is, that's what you should be in your portfolio. Like I said earlier, when I was answering that question, like when you go on my portfolio, and it's grossly out of date, but it's very clear. I do articulate storyline, rise, and Camtasia. It's visually engaging and interactive. That's what I do. That's what I get hired for. If it's for you, it's the upfront parts of instructional design and needs analysis and consulting, then great. That's probably a series of case studies. If it's video work and beyond, then it should probably have a lot of beyond stuff. And if you don't know what those things are, then you're probably not ready to start freelancing. That's the hard answer, is if you don't know exactly what you want to be hired for, then you're probably not ready to be freelancing. That's the inconvenient truth about that. Okay.
Yeah. And what about if, you know, you're you've done a lot of work, but it all is under an NDA or belongs to your employer? Or is there any way that you can repurpose that or use it at all? Or do you just need to start from
Yeah.
scratch?
I mean, you're going to run into those issues where there's stuff that's NDA stuff. That's another thing that I started doing in my contracts is I put in there that I can use the work minus proprietary information. I can use the work, the name of the client, and their logo on my portfolio. I've never had a client say no to that. But when when you're first getting started, you're probably going to have to spend a lot of time creating your own samples of work. One of the things that we do in my community is we do monthly e-learning challenges where we provide a hypothetical style guide and a prompt and all of that stuff to help people do that. And so you probably have to create your own samples of work. If you do have a bunch of work and you can't, you can use parts of it. One of the things you can do is sanitize it. So can you take the cool thing that you did at X and X company, remove the branding, maybe change the branding, remove the proprietary stuff, change that so that you at least have something to start. But a lot of it's probably going to be creating your own samples of work until you start building a backlog of stuff that you can share and put in your portfolio. That's what most people do.
Yeah. What about where to like make the portfolio or host the portfolio? Does it have to be a beautiful website?
Does it have to be a beautiful website? Oh, that's a good question. I'll give a nuanced answer here. For freelancing, I think you do need a website. But I often tell people, when people are trying to find full-time work, a portfolio at the end of the day is a collection of work, not a website. Okay. So, if you're somebody looking for full-time work, a hiring manager doesn't care about your ability to build a pretty website. They care about your samples of work. So you could have stuff put together in, a Google Doc with some great links and some write-ups, right? That could be your portfolio. But as it relates to a freelancer, again, business to business transaction, clients are going to make judgments on you as a individual and as a business based on what they see when they pull you up, right? And so I do think you need to have, it doesn't have to be the most amazing website, but I do think you need a website. Because any business would need a website. Any business needs a website. Maybe I'm wrong to feel this way. I don't know, but I'll tell you how I really feel. Have you ever looked up a local business on Google Maps and you try to click on their website and it just takes you to a Facebook page? And I'm like, no, you're not serious. I don't know if I believe you. Like, I want a website because it's so easy. The bar is set so low in order to build a website nowadays. And so, yeah, I do think you need a website because you want a place where you can host your work. You need a place where you outline your services and outline what you do. But that, in terms of what tools you can use, I guess it's a matter of what do you feel most comfortable with? My first website was in a tool called Adobe Muse, which was like a storyline-esque version of a website builder. And then I moved to WordPress. But nowadays, whether it's Wix or Squarespace or GoDaddy's website builder, there are just so many options in order to build a website. And you can get one up and running in, literally a day. The hardest part is really figuring out the content that goes in it.
Yeah. Well, we've got a few more minutes left. Does anybody have burning questions that I've missed here? I know we have a lot coming in chat, but feel free to jump off mute and ask.
I don't want to speak for Courtney and Megan. I don't have a hard stop, so I'm happy to stay over time if we're able to. So throw them all at me.
I do have a question. Thank you
Go
so
ahead.
much. It's been a fantastic session. My question is about expenses. So, I've never done freelancing before. Did one subcontracting job, but my question is, what would you say are the average monthly or annual expenses, like software licenses, fees, things like that you have to pay in order to continue to operate?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's an average. I mean, if I think about like the bare minimum of what you would need, in my opinion, I think, it depends on if you're doing freelancing where you're doing an authoring tool, that's going to probably be your business expense. So like, let's say Storyline, right? And let me just say this too, like, don't get fooled into buying their AI add-on. It's not worth it. That's a separate thing for a separate day. So like, that's probably going to be your business annual expense. In terms of monthly expenses, like, it's helpful to have a Zoom account. that might cost you 20 bucks a month. I don't actually don't know how much maybe it's, maybe you probably use a free version of Zoom. The other tools that I have is like Adobe, the Adobe suite, which can be like, I think that's like 50 bucks a month. You want access to a stock graphics website. So I use Envato Elements for all of my client work. That's like 20 bucks a month. Like you can run really lean, and then only invest in those tools that are necessary for the project that you're working on. So for example, I don't maintain like a subscription to Wellsud Labs, for example. I've only signed up for that because they offer monthly. I've only signed up for that when a client needed it, and then I cancel it, or I put it on pause. It's usually helpful if you're doing multiple projects to have like a project management software. So like Asana is one that I use. That's like 20 bucks a month. So you can really, really run lean as a freelancer. But when you're subcontracting, you may not need all of that. You may not need a Zoom account and a project management tool because you're subcontracting. You might just need access to that authoring tool. Yeah, so it could be as little as, maybe a couple $100 a month to, depending on what you're doing. My monthly expenses are very different now than when I was first getting started, but my business is diversified a little bit. Ooh, before we finish, I want to talk about diversifying income. So I can't remember who asked that, but I hope that gives an answer there. Okay.
Yes, that was a great answer. Thank you. Appreciate
Okay,
it.
thank you, Jeff. Sorry.
I think Kim had her hand raised next. Kim, what you got for us?
Kim.
Or Kimberly.
Thanks. Hey, Tim.
I see your name all the time. We've never talked.
We had one conversation before, and I definitely appreciate it. It was in the beginning of my journey.
Yeah.
The question I had is, of course, I've been freelancing and had my own business for a while. Is about transitioning from doing it part-time to full-time. I've always been blessed where I'm able to do both. But there may become a day, and I'm not walking out now, but we just never know, especially in the current environment, what may happen. So one day is like you said, I might say F it and let's just do this full time. So besides finances, like you said, saving up, because I've been trying to do that for a while, just in case anyway. What are some other things when you went from part-time to full-time? What were some other things that you had to consider or you hadn't thought about?
That's a great question, Kim. Okay, so when I was at GoDaddy thinking about freelancing, leading up that, like the 6 months leading up to that, one of the things that made me really nervous was I remember saying to myself, I'm like, I want to freelance full time, but nobody's knocking on my door to freelance. So like, what's going to change when I quit? Like, where are these clients going to come from? And so when I did leave GoDaddy, and I started freelance, I made that leap full time. I made a really concerted effort to announce it to the world. Like I went on LinkedIn and I'm like, I fucking quit, people, and I am freelancing, right? And so one of the things that I realized in retrospect of that was like, why would have anybody been knocking at my door? They probably thought, oh, Tim's busy being a director of instructional design. Why would they hire me for being a freelancer? And so like that goes back to that whole, like, you can't do it in secret. You need to get comfortable telling the world what the fuck you're doing. And last thing, real quickly, I have to say this about that is I know like one of the barriers that we put on ourselves is like, gosh, what is my old coworkers going to think? What are these friends going to think? What are those people going to think? And I mean this like to the deepest part of my soul. If there are people out there that would judge you for you like doing what you got to do to take care of yourself, they're not your friends. And really nobody's paying attention to you that much anyhow. You know what I mean? So like you just got to put yourself out there. All right. But the other thing too is like you all have to, if you want to make the leap freelancing full time, you really gotta sit down and take inventory of your life and look at everything you've got going on and go, okay, these are all of the hurdles that are going to prevent me from being able to do this full time. That might be debt. That might be health insurance. That might be kids in school and funding for college, or it might be our mortgage is really expensive, or my partner doesn't work, or what have you. And so what I want to say about that is making the leap from part-time to full-time is not just, I think sometimes it gets sold online as like, I just decided one day I'm going to be a freelancer and look at the split. I quit my job and now I'm freelancing full-time. But like really in reality, when I look back on it, even if I didn't know this intentionally or not, those almost 10 years leading up to me making that leap full time, I was preparing myself for that by building my brand. I was putting myself out there. I had been speaking in conferences. I had been doing all of these things to tee myself up for being successful freelancing and paying off debt and trying to save money and get myself into that position. And so I don't want to fool anybody and say like it's just a random decision you make one day. For me, it was a long game. It was a really, really long game in order to make that. And so, if there's any one thing, if there's any one thing I would tell you all to do if you're doing it part-time, besides saving money, besides paying off debt, is do everything you can to start establishing your brand so that when you do make that leap, like there's no question what Kim's doing. She's a freelancer now, and we all know it because she's been teeing herself up for that. And that might mean, like I said, getting involved in your local ATD chapter. They are always looking for speakers, and speaking is one of the greatest ways to build your brand and your credibility and authority, and get get yourself in front of the eyes of hiring managers. Go apply and speak at a conference if you're able to. Do all of those things. Does that help a little bit, Kim?
It absolutely did. And some of those things were kind of floating in my head. So you gave me confirmation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Okay, do we want to go to the next one? Is it Iana?
Yes, Ayana.
Hi, Ayana.
Hi, sorry, I'm a little nervous, but
That's
I
okay,
had a
don't be nervous.
question, and it was, I guess, more so centered around finding clients. So a little bit of back context. So I've been freelancing full time for about 4 years now. And when I first started, it was like I'm constantly taking projects on, and it was nonstop, like picking up projects back to back, always looking for projects. Like it was never enough. And I've raised my prices several times, but again, it always went back to it's never enough. And it got to a point where it wasn't sustainable because I'm working like all hours of the day, every day, like nonstop. And so up until recently, I would say about the last year, is when I had the opportunity to work with bigger clients. And so, just for context, for those contracts last year probably equated to all the projects that I did the prior years. And that's when I realized, okay, I need to work with bigger clients who have bigger budgets. But getting to my question, how do I market to those bigger companies so I'm not constantly taking all these $3,000 e-learning course here and there back to back when I can work on a larger, 50, 60, $70,000 contract?
Sure. Well, you have to start finding you have to figure out how do you show up in the places that those decision makers exist? Okay. And so where those decision makers exist is usually at that point in their career. I know I already said it. I'm going to repeat it. They're usually participating in their local ATD chapter. They might be on the board of their local ATD chapter. They're usually attending conferences like DevLearn or ATD ICE, and that's another really good example of going and speaking at those, or even just attending those conferences. That can be a huge investment, but it's a tax deductible investment, right? And if you can get in and speak at those conferences, and they're constantly looking for new speakers, and you don't need to be, you don't have to be someone special to speak. You just have to submit a proposal. Then you can go for free. You have to still pay for your travel, but like that's where they congregate. So you have to figure out where do those people congregate, and then you have to start talking to those people and start interacting with them. One of the things that I've also done, this was at least my strategy, and it's worked for me. When as it relates to my brand, like when it comes to my book and the stuff I do on YouTube and a lot of the stuff I publish on LinkedIn, a big part of what I focus on is providing resources for new practitioners, right? But there's a strategy there, because if I can help the new practitioner today, eventually they're going to be the decision maker 5 years from now. And when they're ready to make that decision, they'll be like, oh yeah, you know who helped me when I was getting started? That Tim Slade guy. Oh, let's go hire him. So like you invest your time in people who are going to make those decisions down the line. And also it's like a word of mouth thing. A big part of freelancing is word of mouth. And so, you help somebody, like one of my big clients last year, it was it was the year before last, was Estee Lauder. I went and did a workshop for Estee Lauder in New York City, and that's within like luxury retail. And then that got me in with, they knew somebody at Tiffany and Company, and I went and got to do some work with them. And so a lot of it is word of mouth in that way. But you got to figure out like where do those decision makers congregate, and how can you participate in that in some capacity? You know what I mean? And the last thing I want to say on that point too is for everyone is, you know, one of the things too that I think is a big misconception about freelancing that kind of goes to your point is, you know, when you set your rate, there's this idea, like, I think a lot of times people have this fear that like their clients are going to like get together at a bar at the end of the day and go, what is Tim charging you? Is he charging me this? Whatever. My rate fluctuates depending on who I'm working with. So like, you better believe that I charge Tiffany and Company a way different rate than I charge the nonprofit in Colorado that I did some PowerPoint slides for. You know what I mean? So you can charge whatever you want. And so I'll stop talking there. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that does. Thank you. That was really helpful. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, as far as like putting yourself out there, and attending these events, what would you recommend to someone who's not great at speaking? Like for me, words don't come easily. So when I get into situations where I need to, kind of explain what I do, and like that's just not like it gets like this. So I don't see me being that person that goes to these events to speak, because it just doesn't, it's not a natural setting for me. So like what would you suggest to someone who doesn't have that personal
Yeah.
presence to
So
how would you,
I'm
how
gonna
would you
challenge you on that, because I think you did just a great job asking those questions. You had a really great personal presence just now. So I would challenge that story you've told yourself, because that's not true, in my opinion. So here's what I will say about that. The first time I spoke at a conference was in 2013. And I was so freaking nervous. And I feel, and I'm not naturally a public speaker. I used to be a horrible public speaker. And none of my words came naturally to me. And so I remember I went to a coffee shop and I tried to script out everything I was going to say in this hour-long presentation. And if you've ever done that, you script like 3 paragraphs and you realize like, I can't script out an hour's worth of what I want to say. That's ridiculous. Like, how am I going to memorize that? And so what I realized, the thing that was holding me back as being a speaker was 2 things. First, this idea, and this held me back in a lot of different ways, like sharing stuff on LinkedIn or being on YouTube or starting a blog or whatever, speaking at conferences. The thing I kept telling myself is like, well, who am I to be talking about this? Like, who am I? I'm not an expert in any of this stuff. I still don't consider myself an expert in any of this stuff. So who's going to want to listen to me? Because I'm not an expert. So that was one thing. And then the other thing that held me back a lot was, I think a lot of times our fear of speaking comes from this idea that we have to show up as what all of these other people want us to show up as. And that stuff where words don't come naturally and we stumble over ourselves is because it comes from this place of trying to create this persona that we think other people want from us. Okay. So 2 things that really changed the way I show up right now, the way I show up on YouTube, the way I show up on LinkedIn at conferences. When I went and did that first talk, the first 10 minutes were really, really hard when I was giving that presentation, because I was doing all of the things that I just explained. And eventually I was just like, fuck it. Like, I can't maintain this persona for all of you people. And I'm not an expert in all of this stuff. And so I'm going to stop trying to be something I'm not. I'm just going to show up as me, and I'm not going to talk perfectly. And I'm probably going to curse and say inappropriate things. And I'm just going to show up and be me. And I'm going to use inappropriate humor, and I'm going to stumble over my words. And if you don't like it, then great. Then move the fuck on. Like, I don't care. Like, so that was one big thing for me. And then the other thing about expertise is that I realized I don't need to be an expert in anything to share my experiences. And the thing that you need to realize is nobody really wants your expertise. They want to know your experiences. People want to hear your stories and what you faced when you dealt with X and X project, or you had this challenge, or what have you, right? I'm not an expert in running a business or being a freelancer, but I am an expert in my experience, and nobody can argue that because I freaking experienced it. And so it's not about being an expert in a thing. It's not about showing up and being something that you're not. People want you to show up as you, and they want to hear your experiences. And so to get over that, though, what I challenge you to do is to literally just thrust yourself up onto a stage and share your experiences. And you'll do it, and it's going to be really nerve-wracking. And then you're going to get done, and you're going to realize that a lot of people loved what you had to say, and it's going to create a little confidence seed in you. And then you'll do it a second time. Like, the only way to get better at all that is to do it. There's no other way. So, but let go of this idea that like you have to show up as anything other than you, and you have to show up as some sort of like snooty expert. You know what I mean? Like, nobody cares. They want your stories and experiences. So does that?
Yeah,
I
that
hope that
does.
helps you all
It
somehow.
does. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Good. What other questions? Anything else on anything?
I have a question. Hi, Ashley Cox here. I'm just
Hi,
curious
Ashley.
what you're doing next, Tim. What's on your future horizon?
Oh, I love that. I have something to share. I'm going to put it in chat. So next week I'm going on, I've been posting this on LinkedIn. I'm going to put a chat. I hope nobody minds. I'm going on a writing retreat. So one of the things I started doing several years ago is I go book myself in a hotel room, and I spend the entire time writing. And so I'm going on this writing retreat, and I have this book, my book, the E-Learning Designer's Handbook. I'm rewriting it into 2 separate new books, and I'm writing the first half of it next week. And so that's what I'm working on. And I'm hoping to, one of the things that some of you might have heard me say before, I don't know, if not, you're going to hear me say it now. One of the things that I've learned to do, and this has probably helped me as a freelancer, and maybe it can help some of you, is I've learned to put myself intentionally into high pressure, uncomfortable situations in order to get something done. And I have this acronym called FITFO, and it's called Figure It the Fuck Out. And so I'm going to FITFO and write a book next week. And that's what I'm working on. And I hope to have that out, late spring. And then I'll write the second half in the summer. And that's as far out as I've thought. That's what I'm working on. Yeah. I hope that
I
answers
love it.
Good.
Yes, thank you very much.
Let me talk about that, though. I have something I want to say about that. The other thing, too, I would encourage you all to do in terms of freelancing is that it's really, really critical that you, in my opinion, is that you find opportunities to diversify your income as a freelancer. When I look back to my early days of freelancing full time, only I would say maybe 40% of my income came from actual just freelance development, custom work with clients. And so one of the ways you can diversify your income and help build your brand is, if you're doing, let's say, instructional design consulting as part of your work, well, there's no reason why you couldn't take that expertise and experience you have and turn that into a workshop that you offer teams to help them better consult with their stakeholders and SMEs. And whether that's offering a 3-hour virtual workshop or full-day workshops or what have you, you can make a lot of money. You can make a lot of money doing workshops. I'll make, in a 2-day workshop, I will make a lot more money than I would make in a multi-month long client engagement. Or my book too, like self-publishing a book was one way of diversifying my income. It takes a lot to write a book, but all of those little things, the way I've thought about it before is it's like capitalizing on your expertise in different ways that all help feed one another. So, like when someone buys the book, then they go to my website and then they come, you know what I mean? And like all of it supports itself. And so the more you can find ways to diversify your income, the better off you'll be as a business. Good. Any other questions? Okay.
Going once, going twice.
Oh, I have a question. Tim.
Go ahead.
So I was just wondering, sometimes jobs will be like, hey, we have this contract job, how do you want to be paid? And You get what? You get W-2s as an option. You get like S Corp as an option. I think there's something else that they can do. So I guess if they give you the option, what is the best?
Has that been like if it's for like a long-term contract, like
Yeah,
6 months to 9 months? That's interesting. I've never seen that before.
And I've noticed they really don't want to pay you in W-2 because I guess there's like a lot more hurdles they have to go through. But
yeah, I mean, yeah, being a I mean, the thing about being a freelancer is there's pros and cons. Like as a freelancer, you don't have any protections as an employee. You know, they can terminate it at any time. You got to pay your own taxes, all of that stuff. And then there's risks on the employer's end. You know, if you're a W-2 employee, you know, you're an employee now. You're not just somebody that they're contracting with. I mean, I guess that's a really personal answer. It depends on what you want at that moment. You know, if you become if they pay you as a W-2 employee, then they're going to have more leverage over you, what you can do outside of your work hours. You know what I mean? So, not that any employer should have any leverage over what you do during your free time, but you know, they're more in your business than they would be if you're just a freelancer, and they have more control over your time than if you're a freelancer. So I would say that's really a personal, like where are you at in your life and what do you need at that moment and all of that stuff. You know, I personally, like, I would never go be a W-2 employee again. I would rather, oh gosh, no, I don't want to do that. So I don't know if that's a clear cut answer, but that's how I would view it.
Another consideration, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if you're a W-2, you can't write off your office expenses.
True. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. You can't do that. I mean, you can, I guess there might be a little, it depends on, yeah, there's intricacies there because I have seen some of that, but your expenses aren't going to be as written off. I mean, the nice thing about long-term contracting usually is they're more inclined to provide you that software and equipment because they're going to give you an email and you're working within their ecosystem versus, you know, a one-off engagement. I'm not a big fan, for me, not saying this is not a reason not to do it. I'm not a big fan of long-term, like I really love the non-monogamy of project-based freelancing. You know, like we get in bed, we exchange some money, we have a good time, and then we part ways and I go get another, you know, client. You know, there was a joke in there, but you know, you get it. So long-term contracts, I don't like it because I don't want to get involved in your politics at work. I don't want to do any of that stuff. But yeah, you have to think about the pros and cons there and what works best for your life at that moment in time, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Any other thoughts or questions about anything?
Yeah. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Simon.
I've been binging your material recently, and yeah,
Thank
great
you.
work. Love it. So I'm drooling here. So I'm based in Europe. I'm looking at you, American guys, just drooling at the dollar signs. And I'm wondering whether I'm being delusional, thinking I can get myself a bit of that American pie or not. I don't know whether you have any experience with that of, yeah, the foreigners invading you for a change to see if we can get a bit of the American dream.
No, I don't think that's delusional at all. You know, there's the beauty of freelancing is that the company doesn't have to have a tax entity in where you live in order to pay you. Whereas if you're an employee, you know, remote work is a little bit more complex because they have to have a tax entity where you live in order to pay you. So I don't think that's delusional. They're going to be, you know, here's where it can become a hurdle. And, you know, the smaller the company, the less experience they have with freelancing. If they've never hired a freelancer before and you're somebody from the UK or outside of the US, they might be just a little weird about it because they're ignorant of it. But, you know, if you take a larger company that already has an international presence, you know, the only concern they might have is like, oh, well, you may not be working at the same time we're working. And then that's on you to be like, don't worry, we'll make it work. You know, I might have to stay up later to be on calls. Like there's going to be a little bit of those objections, but the smaller, more established, or the larger, more established companies, I don't think that's delusional. And you should be if it's a US company, you should be charging what a US freelancer would charge.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Tim, I have one quick question, if that's
Yeah, of
okay.
course. Hey, Tori.
Hey, so I asked this earlier, but I've been kind of jumping in and out because I had a few things. So I don't know if you already answered it,
It's okay.
but what are your thoughts on including like a starting at rate on your website so that people can kind of see that automatically? Is that going to, you know,
Oh,
you know,
I guess my question, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a client and how I would perceive that and what I would need to know in order for that number to not, I guess what, if I were to put a starting at rate, I would need to know starting at, and what does that include, right? Like if you have a, I think where that can work is if you've, like one of the things I encourage you all to do, if you're truly interested in like upfront consulting, true consulting work, then what you should do is you should create packages. Like here's a package of, and it includes this is the outcome, this is what you're going to get, and it's a package, and it starts at X amount, right? And so then I would be able to quantify what does that mean? Like if it's, you know, starting at $10,000, well, what does that include, you know, at $10,000? So I think what's important is if you do a starting at, you need to make it really clear, like what service am I getting at for starting at $10,000? Because if I'm hiring you as a one-off project and I need you, I'm making up a hypothetical here. I'm hiring you to help, you know, take some content and build a simple Rise course, and it's not a more complex project than that, I might think, I don't know if that's worth $10,000, right? But again, like you're actively making a decision then of what type of projects you don't want, and I encourage that. So I think it's fair, but you have to. I think it's the onus is on you to say like to at least give a baseline of like what does that mean in terms of what I'm getting at that $10,000 rate. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
I recently looked into your like hourly rate to get some time with you for coaching.
Yes.
Would that be something if I brought to you my offers that we can kind of dive into together?
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay. I was just
Whatever you'd
curious.
like. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course. Good. Any other questions? Actually, I feel like there's so much more I would love to talk about, like firing
Well, maybe
clients.
we can have a part 2.
We need to have a part 2.
We would love to
I'd
have
love to
it.
talk about health insurance and firing clients. I've had to fire clients. That's really fun. Yeah. So I'll end with this. I know we're way over our time. I just want to end with this and say thank you all so much. And I want to say that freelancing is definitely it's wonderful, and it's a lot more work than I think a lot of the talking head people make it sound online. And it requires grit, and you need to remember that you're running a business and you have to think like a business, not like an employee. So I hope that helps. So thank you all for having me.
Absolutely helps, Tim. Thank you so much. This was fantastic, and we appreciate you sticking around for a little bit extra to answer all these great questions too. And if somehow you made it here and you're not in our Slack community, please join us. We will post the recording in there as well. So if you want to go back and hear all these wonderful nuggets again. And we'd love to have you for some of our upcoming events. On Tuesday, March 4th, we're having a roundtable talk with some of our IDLancers about working with different e-learning agencies. Today, we kind of talked about how that might be like a good way to get started if you're just transitioning in. So we'll talk about our experiences with that. And then on Thursday, March 27th, we're going the opposite direction and talking about finding your own direct clients and how they can find you. And that will be with Christy Tucker, which some of you may be familiar with. She's also pretty well known out there. She gets her name out there on LinkedIn and does all the speaking and all of those things Tim talked about. So join our Slack community. You'll find links for that. Follow us on LinkedIn. Megan posts all that stuff all the time. So thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you all. Bye.
Yeah.